May 11, 2026, the Lhotse Face, Mount Everest, Nepal, 11:20 in the evening. 20-year-old Phura Gyaljen Sherpa was 4 hours into a night climb, carrying loads in the dark. He had trained as a monk. He chose the mountain instead. Phura Gyaljen Sherpa was not a beginner, not a wealthy tourist paying $100,000 for someone else to carry his oxygen and fix his ropes. Not an amateur who spent a decade working up to this mountain. Not even in his first season working at altitude. He had already stood on top of the world. In 2025, at just 19 years old, Phura Gyaljen Sherpa summited Mount Everest, 8,848 meters, the highest point on Earth. He then spent an entire season in the European Alps working as a professional mountain guide before returning to Everest for his second year. By every measure, he was exactly where a young, high-altitude professional of his ability was supposed to be. He was the last person who should not have come home. The part that bothers me about this story is that it wasn't just one tragedy. It was a chain, a family, a mountain, and a boy of 20 who had seen both the monastery and the summit and kept coming back for more. These are the terrifying last minutes of Phura Gyaljen Sherpa. Welcome to Tourist Tragedies. To understand why Phura Gyaljen's death silenced the Khumbu, you need to understand what it actually means to summit Everest at 19. Of the roughly 10,000 people who have reached the top of Everest since 1953, the vast majority are adults in their 30s and 40s and 50s. They spend years preparing, they hire guides, they pay permit fees of $15,000 per person, then tens of thousands more for logistics and oxygen and professional support. By the time a typical Everest client stands on the summit, they have spent a decade of their adult life and a small fortune getting there. Phura Gyaljen Sherpa was 19. He had grown up at 3,800 meters in Thame, where the altitude that disables most visitors is simply the air he had always breathed. And in his first professional season on the mountain in 2025, he didn't just work, he summited. While helping to carry the infrastructure of survival for other people's dreams, he reached the top himself. That is the equivalent of starting your first week at a new job, and doing the thing that most senior people in the industry spend years working toward. And honestly, when you look at what Phura Gyaljen had already built at 20s, an Everest summit, a professional guiding season in the Alps, you start to see why his family and his team believed he was at the very beginning of something significant. After the 2025 summit season, he didn't rest. He went to Europe. He spent months working as a mountain guide in the Austrian Alps, refining technical skills alongside international clients before returning to Nepal for 2026, for his second season on Everest. How does a boy become a man who climbs at 7,000 meters in the dark, carrying other people's gear into a storm? In Thame, you are born into it. The village sits at 3,800 meters above sea level, tucked into the Bihot Kosi Valley, west of Namche Bazaar. It is older than modern mountaineering by centuries. For hundreds of years, before the foreign climbers arrived with their permits and their bottled oxygen, Thame was the last stop on the salt trading route between Nepal and Tibet. Caravans of yaks would come over the Nangpala Pass, 5,716 meters of raw Himalayan crossing, loaded with Tibetan wool and salt. They would rest in Thame before the descent into the lower valleys. The mountain was not a challenge to conquer. It was simply the landscape of daily life. Tenzing Norgay, the first man to stand on top of Everest, grew up in Thame. Apa Sherpa, who held the record for most Everest summits for decades, came from Thame. Ang Rita Sherpa was from Thame. In a village of a few hundred people, this is not coincidence. This is culture. This is altitude in the blood. Phura Gyaljen Sherpa was born into this world in 2005, the grandson of the Snow Leopard, the son of Phura Sherpa, Ang Rita's youngest son. He grew up hearing the story of a man who climbed 10 times without oxygen. He grew up at an elevation where most tourists develop splitting headaches just trying to sleep. And at some point in his youth, Phura Gyaljen made a choice that surprised people who knew him. He entered a monastery. He studied as a monk, immersed in the chants and rituals and disciplines of Tibetan Buddhism that have anchored Sherpa culture for centuries. The monks at the Thame Gompa, one of the oldest monasteries in the Khumbu, pray for the safety of climbers before every season. They know the mountain is not tame. He left the monastery. The mountains called louder. In 2025, Phura Gyaljen Sherpa went to Everest for the first time as a professional. He was 19. His job was load carrying, moving oxygen, tents, fixed ropes, and food up the mountain for expedition teams preparing their summit pushes. It is hard, unglamorous work done mostly in the dark and cold. And somewhere in the middle of it, in the spring of 2025, he summited. At 19 years old, Phura Gyaljen Sherpa stood on the highest point on Earth. He came back to base camp, he ate, he rested, he was alive. After the season ended, he didn't go home and stay there. He went to Europe. He spent months in the Austrian Alps working as a professional mountain guide, the kind of cross-cultural, internationally certified career path that represents a new generation of Sherpa, trained and mobile in ways that were simply not possible for the climbers who came before him. Think about what that means. A young man from a Himalayan village at 3,800 meters working the Alps. The highest peak in Austria, the Grossglockner, tops out at 3,798 meters. That is roughly the altitude of Thame village, where Phura Gyaljen had simply grown up. For someone with his lungs, his childhood, his genetics, the Austrian Alps were familiar air. But the season in Europe mattered. It gave him technical refinement, working alongside international clients on different terrain. It gave him the kind of experience the older generation of Sherpas, who learned the mountain entirely on the mountain, had never had access to. He came back to Nepal in time for the 2026 season. The 2026 season arrived. He was 20 now, with a summit already on his record and a winter in the Alps behind him. He was working for K2 Expedition, a Kathmandu-based outfitter. His job in these weeks before the summit push was the same job his grandfather had started with at 15 years old, carrying loads, moving oxygen, tents, food, rope, the entire infrastructure of survival up the mountain for paying clients who needed everything set in place before they arrived. It is unglamorous work. It is essential work. And in the Sherpa tradition, it is honorable work. In the first weeks of May 2026, teams were completing their acclimatization rotations. The weather windows were being studied. The fixed ropes had been run to the South Col. The summit push was days away, and everything above Camp 2 needed to be stocked. Life was, in the language of his world, quite simply full of purpose. On the evening of May 11th, Phura Gyaljen Sherpa loaded his pack at Camp 2, 6,500 meters above sea level, and began to climb. May 11th, 2026, 7 in the evening. Camp 2 sits in the western Coombe, a vast, silent glacier valley flanked by Everest to the right and the sheer walls of Nuptse to the left. At 7 in the evening at this altitude in May, the temperature drops fast. The light is already gone. The Lhotse face, a near vertical wall of blue glacier ice that stretches 600 meters above Camp 2 to Camp 3, is invisible in the dark except for the glow of headlamps moving up it in a line. Phura Gyaljen was not alone. He left with a team of Sherpas, all of them loaded with supplies, all of them heading for Camp 3. This is standard practice before a summit window. Teams do not climb the Lhotse face in daylight during load carries because the afternoon sun loosens ice and triggers rockfall. Night is safer. Night is the protocol. He had done this before. Last season he had summited, which means he had been on the Lhotse face at altitude, at night, with a load. He knew the route. The team began the ascent. The Lhotse face inclines at between 50 and 55 degrees. That is steeper than most staircases. It is hard, compacted blue glacier ice, not snow you can kick steps into, but a surface where crampons barely pierce the surface. Climbers move up it on fixed ropes, clipping and reclipping at each anchor, ascending with a mechanical device called a jumar that slides up the rope but locks when weight is applied downward. For 4 hours, the team climbed. Phura Gyaljen was somewhere near the top of the face, 7,000 meters below Camp 3. He had been moving upward through darkness and cold for 4 hours in the dark, and then, at 11:20 in the evening, something went wrong. One detail stands out to me, reading every account of what happened next. Nobody knows exactly why he slipped. There are no further details, the reports say, about whether he was clipped to the fixed ropes. That sentence is the one that keeps me up at night. To understand what probably happened in those seconds, you need to understand what the Lhotse face actually is. Imagine taking a football stadium and standing it on its end. Now, coat the entire playing surface in glass-smooth ice. Now, load a backpack onto your shoulders, a heavy load of oxygen cylinders and tent equipment, and try to climb it in the dark. After 4 hours, at 7,000 meters where every breath delivers less than half the oxygen available at sea level. The human body at that altitude is already compromised. Reaction times slow, grip strength decreases, judgment becomes subtly unreliable in ways that the climber themselves does not always notice. Elite mountaineers call it hypoxic fog, the quiet, insidious dulling of the mind that happens not all at once but incrementally over hours. Load carrying makes it worse. A loaded Sherpa on the Lhotse face is not just a climber. He is a beast of burden with a shifted center of gravity and restricted movement, operating at the upper edge of human physiology. The fixed ropes are the lifeline. They run the length of the face, anchored at intervals by metal pickets driven into the ice. The system is designed so that a climber who slips, even on that 55-degree glass ice slope, is caught, is held, can recover. But the system requires one thing. You have to be clipped in. We do not know whether Phura Gyaljen was clipped to the fixed rope when he fell. That absence of confirmation is its own piece of the puzzle. What we do know is this. At 7,000 meters, just below Camp 3, somewhere on the upper Lhotse face on a May night in 2026, his foot left the ice. He slipped, 1 foot, 1 moment of lost contact between crampon and ice. On any other slope, a stumble. Here, at 55 degrees, there is no stumble. There is only down. The Lhotse face does not catch you. It accelerates you. 400 meters. That is the distance investigators calculated between where he fell and where he came to rest. In a crevasse, a crack in the glacier, somewhere in the dark band of ice between Camp 2 and Camp 3. 400 meters is roughly the height of the Empire State Building. He covered it not in minutes, but in seconds. His teammates found him. They descended into the crevasse in the dark. They pulled him out. They would have known, the moment they reached him, what the injuries meant. Critical head trauma, severe body injuries, the kind of impact that a human body cannot survive. They brought him to the surface anyway. They carried him down to Camp 2. They placed him at the helipad. They did everything that could be done, because that is what you do for one of your own. He was declared dead following an external examination. The time was approximately 2 in the morning on May 12th. At first light on that morning, a helicopter lifted from the Camp 2 helipad. It carried the body of Phura Gyaljen Sherpa down to Lukla, the same small airstrip at 2,860 meters that thousands of trekkers pass through each year on their way to and from the mountain, having very little idea what the mountain asks of the people who make their experience possible. He was 20 years old. The Sherpa teams who had been climbing with him that night were the ones who found him in the crevasse. They were the ones who carried him out and brought him down to Camp 2 in the dark. That is not in the accident reports. That is just what happens on Everest. The people who work the mountain take care of their own. In Thame, 4,000 meters above sea level, the news arrived the way all terrible news arrives in small mountain communities, quietly and all at once. His family, his village, the community that had produced Tenzing Norgay, and Apa Sherpa, and the Snow Leopard himself. His father, Phura Sherpa, is the youngest son of Ang Rita. A family representative told journalists that the family was beside themselves. There are no adequate words for what it means to send your 20-year-old son to work on a mountain and to have him carried home from it. When you lay the confirmed facts in sequence, a pattern begins to emerge. Not a single catastrophic failure, a stack of compounding risks, what aviation safety scientists call the Swiss cheese model. Each factor is a slice of Swiss cheese, full of holes. On most nights, the holes don't line up. On May 11th, they did. Factor 1. Night climbing on technical terrain. The Lhasa face at 55 degrees is challenging enough in daylight. At night, every visual cue about ice texture, surface condition, and footing quality is reduced to what a headlamp shows you directly in front of your face. Peripheral ice, the inch your crampon lands on, is in shadow. Factor 2. Load fatigue over duration. Phura Gyaljen had been climbing for 4 hours when he fell. At 7,000 meters with a heavy load, 4 hours of sustained effort produces a level of muscular fatigue that compounds the effects of hypoxia. The grip on a jumar weakens. The placement of a crampon becomes slightly less precise. Slightly at 55 degrees is enough. Factor 3. Altitude-induced cognitive slowing. At 7,000 meters without supplemental oxygen, the human brain receives roughly 40% of the oxygen it gets at sea level. This affects not emergency decisions, but micro-decisions. The tiny constant recalibrations of balance and weight that happen dozens of times per minute on a technical face. Factor 4. An unconfirmed attachment to the fixed rope. We don't know. And the fact that we don't know is the loudest fact of all. No single one of these factors kills a climber. Together, lined up perfectly in the dark of one May night, they did. The ancient Tibetan texts studied at the Thame describe Choma Lungma, the mountain westerners call Everest, as the home of a goddess. The monks there pray for the safety of climbers before every season begins. Phura Gyaljen had sat inside those walls. He had chanted those prayers. He had learned, in the disciplined language of the monastery, that the mountain is sacred and not tame, and then he chose to work on it anyway. Somewhere in Thame tonight, prayer flags are snapping in the wind above a monastery that has stood for 400 years. They have outlasted storms and seasons and climbers. They will outlast this grief too, the way they always do. Phura Gyaljen Sherpa died because the mountain is indifferent to preparation, to bloodline, to promise. He was 20 years old. He had already been to the top of the world. Subscribe if you want to keep following these stories. And tell me in the comments, did you know the Sherpa community carried this kind of risk before today?